Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon. In Joel 3:9, the prophet said, "Proclaim this to the nations, prepare for war." America is on the front lines of a battle for our Judeo-Christian values. Our liberties and the future of our republic hangs in the balance as we watch the complete meltdown of society by a Marxist takeover using disinformation and misinformation, especially in our children's classrooms. If we are going to win the war for our republic, it will require Christians and Jews, people of faith and people of conscience, to take our position on the wall and stand on our watch. We must refuse to allow 1 inch of ground to be taken. It is for such a time as this that you have been raised up. Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that shines the light of biblical truth on vital issues from today's headlines that impact every American, Jew and Christian, people of faith and people of conscience. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore. If you missed the last episode of this podcast, you will find it and our previous podcast lineup on our website at pjtn.org, as well as all the other platforms that you use to access your favorite podcasts. I also want to remind you to listen and share this and all of our previous podcasts with your family and friends so that they can become more informed about this and other related issues. Our goal at PJTN is to equip you to stand against the disinformation by taking back local control of your community and your children's and grandchildren's education. The first step to that process is education. We must become informed. Remember to visit our website daily to receive updates on all of PJTN's groundbreaking initiatives and programs, and sign up to receive PJTN's media and action alerts to share with family and friends. You can also follow us on all the social media platforms at PJTN. As a watchman, your action could mean all the difference in the success of our global mission to combat the enemy that is trying to rob our children of their future. So please, help me spread this vital information today. In the Bible, we are commanded to teach our children the Word of God as stated in Joel chapter 1, verse 3. Tell your children about it, let your children tell their children, and their children another generation. That's 3 generations who must be taught about God's covenant with Israel and their exodus from Egypt. Unfortunately, we have failed, and we are witnessing the evidence of that in our classrooms today. So what can we do to take back local control of our communities? What are some actions that must be taken to reverse the course we are currently on? We are witnessing parents and citizens nationwide who are mobilizing against the propaganda and history revisionism being peddled to our children. And now we are even witnessing anti-Semitism and Holocaust revisionism in their curriculum. On a previous podcast, we discussed the National School Board Association's letter to the Biden administration, requesting that they designate parents and citizens who attend school board meetings to hold local school board members accountable as domestic terrorists. In response, Attorney General Merrick Garland essentially issued a declaration of war in a memo to weaponize the FBI, including the criminal division of U.S. attorneys in 14,000 school districts across the U.S., addressing supposed threats against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff, stating that the department will announce a series of measures designed to address the rise of supposed criminal conduct directed towards school personnel. Who is the target of the investigation? Parents and grandparents, moms and dads. It's not Antifa who instigated the January 6th insurrection, murdered people in the streets of our cities, and destroyed public and private property. Nor is it the racist and anti-Semitic Black Lives Matter who launched a modern-day pogrom in Los Angeles. Have law-abiding citizens become the target of our U.S. Attorney General? From Virginia to Washington State, and many points in between, Americans reject the indoctrination of our children with racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Judeo-Christian critical race theory propaganda in our classrooms, and we will not be intimidated into silence. On this week's podcast, I have invited Stephanie Maier to share her personal journey and mission to confront the spiritual forces we are confronting today. Stephanie, welcome to Proclaiming Justice.
Thank you, Lori. I'm thrilled to be here.
So, Stephanie, I first became aware of your organization through a book you authored, The Righteous Fight. And a friend had given that book to me to read. It was one of those books I just couldn't put down. Of course, this is right up my alley, and I'm extremely concerned about the direction our education is heading and what's happening to our country. Tell us a little bit about your story. What compelled you to write this book?
Sure. Well, I've spent the better part of my career, almost 25 years now, since the mid-90s, engaged in teaching people all over the world, including America, but 14 other countries, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, throughout the Middle East, Cambodia, Haiti, all about the importance of freedom, the inherent dignity of every individual, and the inalienable rights that we espouse in our founding in the United States of America, which has been the model of constitutions around the world. And so in one form or fashion, I've always talked about that to secular audiences. I'm a Christian by faith, and our founding is based in Judeo-Christian values. So I've always found it to be aligned. And really what I tell people is if you are someone who believes that the most important calling you have in life, for example, is to espouse your faith to others and be a model of your faith, you have to first defend a free society so that you can go out and actually do that and use the gifts and talents that God instilled in you. So I think it's all rooted in freedom. So that's been my calling, and that's what I've done. I came to write the book. The funny story is I actually wasn't going to write this book at all. I tell people I was going to write a scathing satire about Joe Biden and his terrible Marxist ideology and the horrible policies that he's trying to impose upon our country. So up in the run-up to the 2020 election, I was collecting a nice file on exactly those things. And I was really entertaining myself, being snarky and sarcastic and witty. And it just kept laying on my heart. I just kept feeling this important calling to write this book. And so I kept, okay, that's a nice idea. I'll make some notes. And I would put it aside, and you know how that is. When you have a calling, you have to answer that call, right. Or the signs keep getting bigger and bigger all around you until you do. And so finally, I was obedient to that, and I turned my sights away from my self-indulgent book idea to this. And I'm all the better for it. I actually learned a lot researching this book. Even more than I anticipated. But I think it was important and is important because whether you are Jewish, Christian, atheist even, every single person in America right now who values freedom and the ability to be the architect of their own destiny really needs to stand up right now for our freedom. Everything stems from that. And as parents, we are stewards of our children, and we have to bring them up in the way that we believe is moral and right and just. And it's just not enough anymore to send our children to school and expect the people who are in charge of their education to be forming those characters and principles. I mean, if you send your child to Caesar, don't be surprised if they come back Roman. And that's exactly where we are.
Absolutely. Great analogy. It's interesting because you said that you traveled around the world, and I know you've been involved through the United Nations. And of course, I serve as a special envoy to the UN for the World Council of Independent Christian Churches. And I find it amazing that even before you wrote this book, you were already bringing the message of freedom and liberty, which actually, and I'm sure our audience knows this, liberty is found in the Torah. Liberty, the term liberty, is found in the first 5 books of Moses. And that was what our nation was founded upon. But it's interesting that you were able to share that in different countries with people of different faith backgrounds. But the one thing that, as you mentioned, that we all yearn for in our hearts is freedom. And growing up in America, I'm sure you probably agree with me, we never questioned whether our liberties would one day not be there. We always assumed that we would always have the freedom. We would always be America. But watching what's happening to our country today and watching the indoctrination of our children and watching the Marxist takeover of our classrooms is very disturbing, frightening, in fact. But you wrote about America being locked in a spiritual battle of the ages. Tell our audience about that. What is that spiritual battle? What does it look like?
Sure. Well, America was founded on the idea that your rights come from God and not from people, and certainly not from any state or government. We have to remember it's a flippant thing. People just very easily say, "Oh, sure, we were founded in unalienable rights and Judeo-Christian principles," and then people just sort of move on and forget all about that. But we have to remember, God formed Israel because he loved people and he wanted to have a relationship with people. And people formed America because they loved God and they wanted to go into covenant with God to actually establish a land. And when the Constitution was formed as a government that said in writing all of the things that the government cannot do to you because your rights come from God, a higher authority than the state, that rose the ire of every single dictator and despot and king that there was. And so from the very beginning, the United States of America has been a target. And we're really fighting what I would argue is the original fight. We're fighting good versus evil. We're fighting that same battle of light versus darkness when Satan coveted the kingdom of heaven and wanted a kingdom of his own. People are inherently flawed, and the founders understood human nature, and they understood through their direct experience of tyranny and through the tyranny that people had been experiencing since the beginning of time. I mean, since the beginning of time, most people were living lives that were simply existing and enduring, and they weren't at all empowered with any kind of idea of self-actualization or satisfaction or any of these luxuries that we take for granted today of finding ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. Those are luxuries of free countries. And so our country has been blessed and prosperous because we've always traditionally honored our founding and the nature of our founding in Judeo-Christian principles. For example, even people in America who are not of faith, right? So you take the most extreme of that. You take someone who's an atheist, doesn't believe in God at all. Even atheists in the United States, traditionally, we all had a shared vision where we could believe the same in what is right and wrong. There was right and wrong. There was don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. Mm-hmm. That's rooted in the 10 Commandments, the most basic idea. Mm-hmm. We all agreed, don't murder people, don't lie, don't covet, don't cheat, don't steal. Well, these are biblical principles. And because of that, it's our Judeo-Christian founding. People of faith have been tasked with the stewardship of our freedom because our freedom is rooted in those principles. And so that went along fine until I would argue until our Christian churches actually went ahead and agreed for tax exempt status. So did our other temples and other places of faith. When we agreed to that, and particularly in the Johnson Amendment, when we agreed when we agreed that we would not engage in political discourse, we would not support or oppose candidates, we would not get involved in policy. That was the day that we really became derelict in our duty of that stewardship to say, okay, you know what? That's fine. You go govern. We will leave the policies of our country to the politicians. and we'll go back into our churches and synagogues and pray, and we will be charitable, and we'll stay out of it. But you can't stay out of it, because every single aspect of our lives is God's business. So everything about God is political, and everything political is about God. There's really no getting around that if you are a person of faith. So that's basically and essentially why I wrote the book, because I think that people of faith need to understand that we have a calling and a direct assignment to uphold these principles for our country. And that's why our country has fallen into the mess that it's in, because we've turned away from that assignment.
That's exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. You know, Stephanie, sometimes this battle feels overwhelming. I'm sure you can agree with me, for someone who's on the front lines, having to confront these issues and try to salvage what God has blessed us with. It feels like we're playing a game of whack-a-mole. In fact, you know, I have 5 kids. I spent many a day in Chuck E. Cheese. And of course, one of my daughters, that was her favorite game. It was my favorite game too. And of course, she happens to be the daughter that most takes after me. But playing whack-a-mole, you know, as you play that game, the game speeds up. You try to, you know, whack the mole that comes out of the hole, and the game ultimately starts to speed up, and you're trying to keep up. And here I was with my daughter trying to play to help her beat the mole. But it really feels like that's what we're doing today, that we're playing a game of whack-a-mole. Every time, you know, we hit something, we go after one issue, it's like something pops up out of a hole, another hole. And, you know, the question I have for you, Stephanie, do you think Americans of faith are up for this challenge for such a time as this?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think, you know, it can be overwhelming. There's no doubt about it. It can even be depressing at times, let's face it. But the reason that I think we have no need to ever be discouraged, number one, you have to remember that you have authority in your assignment. We know that particularly people of faith, and I would include anyone who's a freedom-minded person, right? I don't want to exclude anyone who isn't of faith, but particularly of people of faith, God has never lost a battle he's ever engaged in. So we already know how this movie ends. We already know that we're on the side of right, and God has called us to stand up and step into our assignment. So there's really, number one, no option if you're someone who believes that. And number two, you can rise up and stand up with confidence because God put you on the earth for a time such as this, right? So what I find really incredible and fills me with awe, and it should fill every single person with awe, is God could have put you on earth at any time in history. When you look back at any of the incredible, difficult, challenging times in all of the history of the world, you could have lived during those times, but God put you on this earth for this time. And there's a reason. It wasn't just random. There's a reason that you are called to be here now. There's a specific reason that Lori Cardozo-Moore needs to be here in this time, in this generation. There's a specific reason why I do, why anyone we know does. And so that should fill you with a sense of incredible humility and incredible awe at the time you're living in. Now, to go back to being overwhelmed in the whack-a-mole, you know, I have these moments of awe and wonder, but then you have to get out in the world and drive on the streets and and live with the rest of the people, and we're all flawed, so it's difficult, right? But part of the reason, and this has been a constant everywhere I go, part of the reason that people get overwhelmed, and it's perfectly understandable, is we tend to set our sights too high. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, it is true that the battle we have to wage in order to secure our freedom, and as I say on my book, Reclaim the Soul of America, is a big one. It is definitely a Goliath, and we are David. However, that's okay. The part I mean that where we focus our sights too high is we tend to focus on federal issues and even global issues where, you know, if you think about it, how can you, Lori, and your daughter sitting at home at your breakfast table with all of the passion that you have in your heart, how can you end world hunger? How can you abolish critical race theory from every school in America? These ideas are expansive and they're too much. So the way to actually tackle a very, very large idea is exactly how David did with Goliath. He took a little stone and he hit a very small spot, but it was the right spot at the right time. It's the same way. So what you have to do in these issues is you don't focus on these massive, big federal ideas. You get very, very granular and you focus on a local level. And then what you do is when you can effectively make change at a local level in one specific area, you duplicate that all over. And that's how you actually affect change. So people are getting overwhelmed because we're bombarded with these very big, very dark ideas and we want to stop it. But it's a bit overwhelming unless you take a breath and you understand that you have to act exactly where you are with what you have at that time. And that will put you on the path to make change.
Absolutely. Great analogy. There's the doctrine of lesser magistrates, which is rooted in the historical biblical doctrine of interposition. And interposition is that calling of God, which causes one to step into the gap, just like what you were talking about, willing to place oneself between the oppressor and the victim. And we see that with our children, with what's happening with our kids. This lesser magistrate demonstrates the doctrine of interposition by placing ourselves between the tyrant or bad law and the people. And we look at what's happening in our classrooms to our children. We look at how our children are being used as propaganda guinea pigs to indoctrinate them. And unfortunately, we have failed to get into that position to stand. And just like what you were talking about, we were put here on the earth for such a time as this. We didn't come in, just like what you said, I use that analogy often, Stephanie, that we didn't randomly just come into the world. We didn't randomly just happen to be born to our parents. We were chosen for these parents. We were chosen to be born in the United States of America. And then we were equipped. God knew. He created us. He knit us together in our mother's womb. He gave us all of the talents and the abilities that he gave to us for this hour. And it's so critically important that we stand up. And, one of the things that the debates, if you will, that I get into with Christians or even Jews for that matter. And you wrote about this, about God in politics. You wrote about God's politics needing to mirror our own. What does that look like, Stephanie? Where in the Bible can we turn to find those answers, to show the people, the naysayers who say, God wouldn't do this? I just had an article somebody sent to me from a leading publication, international publication, who wrote about a gentleman who prayed out of the book of Psalms for our leaders, and how the person who wrote the article used this leader as an example of how people of faith should be acting. We should be praying for our leaders, not acting, not showing up in Washington, D.C. to make sure that we hold our elected officials accountable, like what happened on January 6th. That was not an insurrection, as I mentioned in my opening statement, that was launched by Trump supporters. The Trump supporters were there for a very specific purpose, and that was to send the message to our elected officials that we are here in D.C. We are watching how you vote. We will not tolerate corruption in the electoral process. And unfortunately, we know how it all ended. And of course, we were the people that were there to support our elected officials and send the message to them that we're here watching. Unfortunately, that story wasn't told. Instead, there was another narrative that was communicated. But getting back to God and politics, what does it look like? Where in the Bible can we find, where can we turn to find those answers, Stephanie, about God's politics mirroring our own?
I just love that question because I would direct you to page 1 all the way through the end. That's where you can start. The reason I say that is because from the very beginning, when God breathed light into existence, there was darkness and then there was light. We've always had darkness and light. We've always had a dual existence. As soon as he said he created man and woman, just the two, by the way. So there's your first political issue right there in the beginning. He didn't create multiple genders. He didn't create gender fluidity. He didn't say kind of be what you feel. He created man and woman in his own image, each distinctively different, yet both reflecting him. We complete one another, and God had a vision for that. He had a vision for the ideals that we should be striving for if we're going to step into the fullness of who we are. So from the very beginning, he helped us to form our identity. He created our identity, which is man and woman. And there's a reason men are filled with testosterone, and there's a reason women are filled with estrogen, and we all have purposes, equal but different. So right from the beginning, I think you could jump off into political discussions just about that, but God's vision is clear. Now, God has always had a hand throughout every book of the Bible. God is involved in every aspect of our lives. Whether you start from the Song of Solomon, you can dive right in there, have conversations with your teenagers, because the Song of Solomon teaches us all about God's vision for sex, dating, marriage, love, and relationships. You can go into warfare. God, whether God was speaking through Moses to argue about human rights abuses and slavery with the Egyptians, and he would give battle advice against the Philistines. He was there for David against Goliath. All the way through the Bible, we see time after time after time. The walls of Jericho, there were very specific instructions of what we had to do to march around the walls of Jericho in order to win that battle. And when we are obedient to God, we win. And when we're not obedient, we don't win. This has been the precedent that's been set since that time all the way to today. And the issues that the people of the Bible were dealing with are the same issues that we're dealing with today, because the nature of humans is the same as back then, even if the technology changes. So, Jesus, I talk to Christians about the fact that Jesus was the original grassroots organizer. And if you want to look at how Jesus engaged people, how did Jesus win souls? How did he profess the gospel? Did he come with a top-down, authoritarian, coercive power? He certainly could have. He could have come and intimidated us all and scared us all into obedience, but he didn't do that, because to have an authentic relationship, you have to have people who are coming freely of their own will. So Jesus understood the basics of grassroots organizing, which is you leave the walls of the temple and you go out to where the people are. You meet them where they are on their own terms. You speak in ways that they can relate to, which is telling stories and using images, because people remember stories more than they do statistics. You engage them by engaging their hearts and minds. So Jesus, he also trained up his disciples. So you train up teachers and you let them go out and duplicate your message. This is the essential grassroots organizing, where you get volunteers to join your movement. You educate them, and then you build them up to be leaders, who then go out and build others up to be leaders. These are all essentials, and they haven't changed since time immemorial. So I think you can look to the Bible for example after example of where God built his church and built discipleship and built people up, including, starting with Moses, who was a stutterer. Moses argued with God and said, look, really, are you sure you want me? I can't even speak, right? I'm not a good speaker. He said, look, trust me, okay? Just give me the benefit of the doubt. I think you'll find you'll be fine. So God builds up leaders in this way, but it's always through voluntary cooperation by winning hearts and minds. And we can look to those examples to understand how we need to engage people today. I think a lot of the fact that God gifted all of us with unique talents, right? Unique gifts and talents. And it's part of our exciting journey in life to try and discover from the time you're young. That's why you try a lot of things, because you want to discover what your gifts and talents are. And I remember when I was in my 20s and I started going to church on my own, I was traveling a lot, and I would find a church in my area. And everywhere I went, evangelical Christian churches have sort of a similar formula. They have great music. I like that. But I would look at these churches and I would think, gee, I don't know how I'm ever going to serve God, because every time I look at church, the women in church are great singers and they're married to pastors or church leaders. And I can't sing, and I don't see myself marrying someone in the church. So I guess if I just don't see myself up there, right?
Right.
But that's because I didn't understand that the way you are is exactly how God intended you to be for His purposes, and that's the exploration you should be making is, how is God going to use me and all the quirky things He put inside of me, right? So God made me someone who loves to talk, and someone who loves to write, and someone who loves to travel, and there's my whole mission now, right? Is preaching, educating, and empowering people at the intersection of God and good governance. I think about the runner Eric Liddell. He said, God made me fast, and I feel closest to Him when I run. Well, that's because he was using his gifts and talents in the way that God made him to use them. So we have to remember we're empowered to do what we can right where we are. And we don't have to look at other people or great, big, famous people who seem like they're doing great stuff to think, well, we have to be like that. No, you can engage right from where you are, right in the middle of the desolates of the desert, just like Jesus did, and just like we're all called to do.
That's right. That's a great analogy. And one of my favorite Bible studies, and you may be too young to remember this, but Henry Blackaby had a Bible study back in the 90s that was a big hit. Everybody was doing it. And it was called Experiencing God. And one of the central themes of the study was helping people find where God was working and to put themselves into the middle of it. His whole focus was trying to train people, just average citizens, people like you and I, to look at our gifts, look at where God is working, and then put ourselves right in the middle of it. You talk about that in your book. You talk about discussing, people of faith and needing to exercise their spiritual muscle in order to confront this evil, to win this battle in our day. Talk a little bit more. Explain what you mean, Stephanie.
Well, and I you remind me now of the 7 mountains of influence, right? Which is really where we're talking about all these different institutions in our society. So there's family, education, church, science, technology, government is one. Media. There's business, that's another one. Media is another one. So there's all these different, institutions in our country that you can examine yourself and see where you can make your most important contribution based on your gifts, your talents, and your experiences. That's where you should start, because unfortunately the reality is every single one of our key institutions that has made our culture have a shared vision and that has kept America as strong as it is has been infiltrated by Marxism, Marxist ideology. And so while we need to fellowship with one another as freedom-loving people, to build each other up and to reinforce what we believe and to learn from one another, we also have to face that dark serpent, which is Marxist ideology, even totalitarianism. 2 years ago, I was using the word socialism. Today, it's like we hit an oil slick at socialism and we scred right into communism. I think we're really talking about communist ideology now. It's not these flirtations like socialism. And so we have to be able to stand up and actually study and become sophisticated in our understanding of history and our understanding of how we got to such an insidious place. Right. Because right now we're at a place where there are a lot of people in our country who are empty inside. This is why you see the rise of suicides. You see the rise of, I would argue, all kinds of religions. There are people who think they're not quote unquote religious, but they are, because you've got climate change as a religion. There's a dogmatic loyalty to climate change alarmists. There is a dogmatic loyalty to critical race theory. There's a dogmatic loyalty to the belief in unlimited genders and gender bending. and even things like abortion. All of these dark ideologies demand loyalty in a way that is almost cult-like, and people find belief and purpose in that if they're empty to begin with. So we have to be able to understand what's going on, and that does take a lot of preparation internally in yourself to understand the authority that you have, that you speak for truth and righteousness, and not to get too distracted. You know, on the one hand, just let me add this. When you're engaging in these kinds of battles, you're going to engage in debates, but you have to know the right kind of debates to engage in, and not to let people who are blinded by lies just consume your time and energy arguing and running in circles, right? You know, Eisenhower said, if the state gives you rights, it will inherently take away those rights. And so we just have to be vigilant and focused in our assignment to say, no, you know what? Here's what's going on. I recognize, for example, moral relativism. I recognize that moral relativism and the idea that there's your truth and my truth. No. Okay, I reject that. I see it. I know it's happening, but I'm going to focus on what I know, which is there is the truth and there's everything else. There is right and wrong, right. And there is what you're trying to distract me with, right? So I'm not going to be taken off my path by spending so much time arguing with my former classmates from high school on Facebook and not actually being effective. I have to think of the ways that I can use my knowledge and energy to be effective and impactful. And that's where, you know, your event is going to be so important, is to get people to focus themselves with laser-like precision on what matters. And that is, number one, understanding what is wrong, understanding how we got to this point, but also understanding what you can do, and then not being knocked off that path by all the noise.
That's exactly right. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephanie hit the nail on the head. This leads us to discussing how you can get involved, how you can be equipped. And on February 12th and the 13th, Stephanie will join me and Matt Staver with Liberty Counsel for a day-and-a-half summit called Taking Back America's Children. This action-packed weekend is to educate and equip you with the tools to take back control of your community, beginning with your school board. You do not want to miss this important weekend. 2022 is an election year. Not only will we have the congressional and senatorial federal elections, but more importantly, we have school board races too. And most people don't even get involved in these races. Most people don't know who their school board members are. This is critically important. We have to understand, just like Stephanie was sharing with us, we don't need to look at the 30,000-foot view if we just focus on our neighborhood. And I want to encourage you to go to our website to register for this action-packed weekend. This is going to be the first of many summits across the country this year. We're going to do our Orlando summit, then we're going to Texas, we're going to be in Tennessee, we're going to be in Ohio, and we're going to California and any other states where people want to gather their family, their friends, their congregation to have a training, a weekend training. It's just a day and a half. And we want to equip you with the tools that you need to show you how to do it and then give you and release you. But we will not just release you and not hold your hand through the process. We will be there also. It's very important that we go after these school board races. George Soros knows this. He has invested millions of dollars over the years in school board races because he knew if he could get to the minds of our kids, not just on university campuses, but in K through 12, he could literally change the whole dynamics of this country, and he has succeeded. And now the one thing that Soros doesn't have is the boots on the ground. You and I. He may have lots of money to invest in races, but he doesn't have the bulk of the people. The bulk of Americans agree with us. And that's what this whole training, this summit is there to do for you. So I want to encourage you, Go to our website to register for this action-packed weekend to learn from the experts in how to take back local control of your children's education. It starts with you. And of course, it's going to be in sunny Orlando. So, Stephanie, everybody wants to be in Orlando in February, right? Out of the cold, out of the snow.
I know I'll be there. You know, Lori, one of the things that I just want to add, because the event you're having is so important. I'm so honored that I'm going to be there, because in all of my travels and all the years that I've been conducting grassroots training, the thing that I am asked when I talk about this Marxist ideology and these big issues that we are faced in having to change is they say, oh my goodness, okay, I understand, I see it. I'm angry. What can we do? People feel powerless to know what to do. And that's where this specific training really comes in, we're going to raise the bar of people's understanding of how to engage in ways that matter, and not just, spin your wheels and feel exhausted about what's going on in the country, but actually hone in on what you can do. And that's important.
Yes, and we're going to start by going to the state that is the freest state with Governor Ron DeSantis, who is actually a living example of what it means to be involved locally. And thank God he is protecting and defending the citizens of the state of Florida. Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing your inspiring words and encouragement for such a time as this. You're amazing, and we look forward to seeing you in Orlando in a month. And we hope that all of our audience will join us and come and meet Stephanie. She's going to have a table there with some of her materials. She's going to conduct the training on Sunday. This is going to be Come Prepared to Work. And it's going to be at the Sheraton Hotel in North Orlando. This is in the Maitland area. Just call, make reservations. We've got rooms, special rate rooms for anyone who comes in from across the country. And again, you'll have a weekend where you get to do this training, bring your family and friends, and then you'll have some extra time to take the kids to Disney World or one of the amazing parks in the city. But ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this program. We will post this podcast on our website and all of our podcast platforms so that you can share with your family and friends. As a PJTN Watchman, you have a biblical mandate to stand against the rising anti-Semitic incidents taking place globally. More and more Christians are falling prey to the anti-Semitic rhetoric on social media platforms, and we cannot remain silent. God warned the prophet Ezekiel about the responsibility of the watchman, and whether it's critical race theory in our school, whether it's anti-Semitic Holocaust revisionist content in our school, if we are educated, if we're informed, and we see the enemy advancing, it is the responsibility, as God told the prophet Ezekiel, of the watchman to warn the inhabitants of the city. You and I, those of you who are tuning in right now, you and I know what's at stake. We see how the enemy has infiltrated. Now we have to share this message with our family and friends, with our neighbors. As a watchman, you can sound the alarm and warn others by simply sharing this podcast and information about our upcoming Taking Back America's Children Summit, February 12th and 13th, with your family and friends. Remember, just go to pjtn.org. You can register. It's right there on the homepage. And I want to leave you with some sobering words by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We were reminded that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was taken captive by the Nazis, and he was murdered. He was hung 4 days before the camps were liberated. But he said, silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. In closing, don't forget to join us for next week's podcast as we continue this conversation about combating the rise of anti-Semitism and taking back local control of our communities and our children's education. I want to also remind you that if you have not signed up to become a PJTN Watchman, you can help support this effort and more programs like this for just $20 a month. With your generous monthly donation, you can ensure that PJTN is on the front lines and in the headlines, but we can't do it without your faithful prayers and financial support. I hope that you will prayerfully consider supporting our mission as we educate to activate Jews, Christians, and all people of conscience to stand on the front lines of this all-encompassing war. I want to leave you with a word of encouragement found in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 1 through 4. God told Moses, when you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And when you draw near to the battle, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people, and shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are drawing near for the battle against your enemies. Let not your heart faint. Do not fear or panic, or be in dread of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you the victory. God bless you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for all you do on behalf of our Jewish brethren, the State of Israel, and these United States. Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.